And now I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on the challenges of managing generational diversity in the workplace. I'm going to hand things over to our featured presenter today. She is president of Forte Leadership Group, Mrs. Jill Schichter. Jill, you now have the floor.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and hello, everyone. Let me share with you the, hang on one second, here we go. Here comes the agenda for today's webinar. We're going to be talking about generational categories. We're going to talk about differences, similarities, and motivators between the generations. I'm also going to spend a little bit of time talking about Gen Y, also known as Millennials, because they actually comprise the largest component of our workforce. And there are some very distinct features to Gen Y and Millennials to really understand them in order to be able to motivate them and have them grow and develop within the organization. Going to talk about 6 management tips on how to manage all the generations in the workforce, as well as improving individual relationships with the different generations, a step-by-step approach. And then finally, we'll talk about moving from knowledge that you've gained during this webinar to what actions you are going to take in order to move forward. So here's a little map of the generations. We have the first generation, which is called the silent generation, also known as traditionalists, and those are folks who are range in age from 73 to 90. Then we have boomers, ages 54 to 72, Gen X, ages 38 to 53. Then we have millennials, and they range right up in age from 39 to, hang on one second here. Whoops, let me go back. Sorry, folks. They go up to ages 37. And then we have Gen Z, which is not on this chart because they are just entering the workforce. And those would be folks who would be anywhere from ages 22 and under. So they're just behind the millennials, who are ages 22 to 37. Going to do a little poll here. Defined by year of birth to see who's on the line, and then I can adjust the presentation accordingly depending on how many folks from which generation are on the line. Now, one thing I do want to share with you is that depending on which amount of research you're reading, you will see different dates for when boomers, for example, begin and end. But these are generally, from the dates that I'm giving you now, these are generally what you will find in most research. So, which generation defined by year of birth are you? Are you a traditionalist, born before 46, a boomer, born between 46 to 64, a Gen X, 65 to 80, a Gen Y, 1981 to 1996, or are you a Gen Z born after 1996? And I'll turn it over to you, Kelly.
All right, Jill, we have no traditionalists on the line. 35% for boomers, 35% for Gen X, and 30% for Gen Y, and then no Gen Z.
Thank you, I appreciate that. All right, we're going to do one more poll. Which generation do you typically have the most difficulty with in the workplace? Most difficulty with traditionalists, ages 73 and up, boomers, 54 to 72, Gen X, ages 38 to 53, Gen Y, ages 22 to 37, or Gen Z, under the age of 22. And please remember your response because we're going to be coming back to this towards the end of the presentation.
All right, Jill, it looks like our results are 2% traditionalists, 25% boomers, 23% Gen X, 44% millennials, and 6% Gen Z.
All right, so it's a good thing then that we are spending a little bit of time on millennials, given the fact that 44% is indicated. Thanks everyone for doing those polls. All right, let's talk a little bit about what defines a generation. So the first thing is it's usually a span. It's usually a 15 to 20 year span, and that's how researchers categorize the generations. Also, parenting helps to define and shape a generation. For example, helicopter parents. Millennials have parents who tend to hover a lot, who overschedule them, who take a look at their homework, who defend them, when the going gets rough and so on. So they're called helicopter parents because they tend to hover. Or latchkey kids, which is a symbol of Generation X. Where these folks had two parents who worked outside the home. They let themselves into the house after school, and they subsequently became very independent thinkers and doers. Traditionalists, for example, the parenting style during those years was children should be seen and not heard. So parenting styles very much help to shape a generation. World and cultural events help to shape a generation. 9/11, the Me Too movement, war, women's liberation, all of these help to define how generations respond to their surroundings. Technology is huge, computers, social media, smartphones, that has really helped to define especially Generation X, Y, and Z. And then finally, the economy. The 2008 recession had a huge impact on Generation X, for example. Unemployment, the whole era of mergers and acquisitions and downsizing helps to shape a generation and how they think about work, how they think about family, how they think about life in general. So these are all symbols or symptoms of what defines a generation. Here's a really interesting slide on the generational workplace, and this is really important to remember and to understand. So traditionalists will be 1% of the workforce in 2020. Boomers will be 22% of the workforce in 2020. Generation X will be 20% of the workforce in 2020. Gen Y or Millennials will be 50% of the workforce in 2020, and then Gen Z will be 7% of the workforce in 2020. So what that means is that Gen Y and Gen Z will compose over half, in actual fact 57% of global employees within the next 2 years, while the other generations are still in the workplace. So it's particularly important to understand Gen Y and Gen Z, who are just coming into the workforce now, Gen Y and Gen Z, so that we can have a workplace that is harmonious, that helps to develop people, and so on. So this is a very important slide to remember. Let's talk a little bit about generational characteristics, and I'll give you a couple of views. So here's one view. Traditionalists, they value stability and security and norms, and they trust hierarchy. They have this ability to understand complex structures, and they're uncomfortable with ambiguity. Remember, these are the folks who are ages 73 and up. Then we have boomers, and they have this sort of you can do anything attitude. They're seen as workaholics, politically correct idealists. They define their life by their work, and now, ironically, they crave balance. And those are folks between the ages of 54 to 72. Generation X are resourceful and independent. These are the latchkey kids. They're very tech savvy. They don't depend on the company to take care of them, and they crave variety and stimulation. And they're ages 38 to 53. You've got Gen Y and Millennials. They are digital authorities. They are dedicated to wellness and social responsibility and the sharing economy. They're very averse to cumbersome structures. They're great at multitasking, and they really do seek a mentor. And they're between the ages of 22 to 37. And then finally, we have Gen Z. Now, the jury's out a little bit on this one because there's not a lot of research on them. They're just coming into the workforce. However, researchers are starting to notice a trend. And what they're saying is that this generation really appreciates differences. They think for themselves, they're independent-minded. They're also realistic, very creative with technology. They enjoy teaming. They have a very strong sense of social responsibility. and they want a very flexible lifestyle. What's also interesting in terms of the research that's coming up with this group is that many of them have a sort of this entrepreneurial bent. So what they're thinking about as they're contemplating their future is being an entrepreneur. So if they're coming into the workforce, into the workplace, into your workplace, understand that this is going to be a generation that is very independent-minded, and they may have some discomfort around structures and systems and procedures and protocol. It's just because of the way their mind is working, where they're thinking very, very large. So do millennials, as a matter of fact. Millennials actually think that, you know, they're here on this earth to really make a difference. They've been conditioned to think that. They really do believe that. And again, they may resist cumbersome structures and the status quo. Here's another view of generational characteristics. So traditionalists, duty and loyalty are very important. They can spend their entire career at one company, very inclined to follow the rules. They may struggle with technology, but they are actually the most engaged generation according to research. They really want opportunities to learn and to contribute. They like teamwork, and they expect their experience to be respected, almost to the point of deference. Then you've got boomers. They often see their self-worth tied to career. They're seen by others as workaholics driven by material acquisitions and titles. Their youth orientation has helped them try to embrace technology. They prefer face-to-face communication. They love meetings, and they want respect and consideration given to their ideas. Now, before I go on with Gen X and Gen Y, I do want to say that these are general characteristics. Nothing is absolute. Human beings are multidimensional, and depending on your circumstances, you may be on the cusp of being a boomer or a Gen X, you know, either at the front end or the tail end. Certain circumstances may actually have you act more in a, let's say, a Gen X way than a boomer way, despite your age category. So, but these are general characteristics. I say that because, for example, I am a boomer and I have 3 millennial sons. And so while I absolutely have some of the characteristics of a boomer, a lot of my thinking and a lot of my actions have actually been shaped by my millennial sons. So I have a lot of millennial thinking that goes on in my brain. Let's continue on with Generation X. Latchkey kids. They're independent, they're self-directed, they challenge the status quo, they are skeptical of authority, they're very focused on results, and they're motivated by a need for security, in part because of that 2008 recession, which really hit this generation hard. So they're very motivated by a need for security. They're self-sufficient, they ask for feedback only when they need it, very tech savvy, they want clear goals and autonomy to achieve those goals. So when you're dealing with a Gen Xer, you might explain what you want your outcome to be, let them figure out how to get there. And then finally, they're known as the sandwich generation. A lot of frustration for this generation because they will always be known as the sandwich generation because they will never be as large as the boomer population, which used to be the largest part of the workforce, and they'll never be as large as Gen Y, which is now coming up to be the largest component of the workforce. And that's why they're called the sandwich generation. This group of people actually makes really good mentors, really good coaches, because they understand sort of the boomer mentality and they also understand sort of the Gen Y mentality. So this is actually a really good group to develop to become managers and become mentors and become coaches for the organization. Let's talk a little bit about generational differences. And I have 2 columns here. I have traditionalists and boomers on one side, and I have Gen X, Y, and Z on the other side. And there's a dividing line. And the greatest dividing line between traditionalists and boomers on the one hand and Gen X, Y, and Z on the other hand is technology. That has had the most profound impact on how people think, how people act, how people relate to each other, how they do their work, how they get information, and so on. So for example, traditionalists and boomers communicate face-to-face, Gen X, Y, and Z like to communicate through technology. Boomers and traditionalists hold to established policy. Gen X, Y, and Z create a new policy. One group processes large amounts of information carefully. Gen X, Y, and Z processes large amounts of information very quickly. Boomers and traditionalists define multitasking as juggling 2 to 4 projects from a single source, whereas X, Y, and Z define multitasking as juggling 6 to 8 projects from multiple sources. One group likes this atmosphere of structure and order. Gen X, Y, and Z like a community atmosphere. Traditionalists and boomers delay gratification. They know that rewards come in time. Whereas Gen X, Y, and Z, they seek instant everything, feedback, rewards, information. And then finally, traditionalists and boomers live to work, and Gen X, Y, and Z work to live. So those are some fundamental differences between the generations. And I think it's also really important to understand similarities. This research came from the University of Minnesota, and there have been a lot of other studies. I happen to like this one that shows about similarities around happiness in the workplace. So a bunch of folks among different generations were asked, what makes you happiest in the workplace? And the striking thing about it, and this was done before Gen Z actually came into the workplace. So we have traditionalist boomers, Gen X, and Gen Y on this study. And the top 3 things that created happiness in the workplace was common to all 4 generations, which is really quite startling. And that was feeling valued, recognition and appreciation, and a supportive environment. Those 3 things across all the generations ranked the highest: feeling valued, recognition and appreciation, and a supportive environment. So when you are leading your teams, when you are looking at performance, when you're conducting a meeting, when it comes time for reviews, when you're hiring, when you're looking at succession planning and all of those things, and creating an atmosphere that is productive and where people are contributing at their highest level, in part because they are happy, remember to incorporate these 3 things into your leadership plans: feeling valued, recognition and appreciation, and a supportive environment. And depending on which generation you're talking to, ask the question about what type of recognition means the most to you. What's most meaningful to you? Because it will be different for different generations. Ask the question about what would make you feel valued in this organization so that you can incorporate that into your development plans, knowing that these 3 elements are what will create happiness in the workplace, and a happy workplace is a productive workplace where people contribute at their highest level and also maintains a high standard of loyalty in the workplace. Very important piece of research. So let's talk about millennials and the millennial mindset. Very, very interesting generation. So the first thing is that millennials feel like they are destined to do something great, defined not as fame or money or personal power, but rather as a means to a greater good. They've been raised to feel that they can make a difference and that their presence is important. They want to feel that what they do matters, that it matters to the team and to the company's mission and vision. They want to understand how their work is important in the world and to others. Now, with this desire to do something great, I want to make an impact mentality, they need to learn patience, that things that really matter take time to nurture. And so it's your role as leader to understand that impatience, if you will, and that desire to do something great, and channel that, show them a path to growth. They need to understand as well that if they fall down on the job, that if they fail at something, that it's not the failure that counts, it's how you get up. And failure can be a sort of a foreign concept to millennials. I mean, in a lot of school systems now, teachers are not allowed to fail students, so they don't understand what it's like to fail. Or if they're on a sports team, for example, and some people have trained really hard and other people are just kind of showing up, kids are very often given medals just for showing up. And so this whole concept of accomplishment and working really hard to get what you want can be a foreign concept to many millennials. So it's really important to understand what their background is, how they've been raised, and how they respond to failure, what constitutes failure in their mind, and also to help them practice the art of patience. The world is very flat to millennials who are used to having access to virtually any information they want, when they want it, however they want it. They are growing up one click away from all the information in the world. And so the ability to quickly understand what news is relevant to their life and work and what isn't, all within a few moments, is really critical. They want things instantly. And this access to information means that hierarchy can be an obsolete concept for many millennials. In other words, they have access to all kinds of information. They don't understand why in an organization information is withheld from them. They really don't. They feel that information is democratic and that they should be in on everything. And so again, it's a manager's job to explain to a millennial that this thirst, this hunger, this almost sense of entitlement around information does not always work in an organization, and here's why. So just know that this thirst for information is just, it's like breathing air to a millennial. They're just so used to getting information whenever they want. It's also this whole idea about, instant gratification, and having access to, anything that they want at a moment's notice. I mean, just take a look at how people buy things these days with Amazon, for example, where you go online, you fill in the form, and it's basically at your doorstep almost the next day. So it's this idea of instant everything that sort of impacts a millennial's ability to understand patience. Here's an important concept as well around project management. So context and clarity is needed for projects. Millennials have been over-directed since childhood. So many of them expect to be given guidelines and feedback along the way. So if you find that a project has not been completed according to your satisfaction, and a millennial is handling the project, don't all of a sudden finish the task yourself, get impatient and finish the task yourself. Spend time mentoring millennials and transferring knowledge instead of finishing the task yourself. Now, what happens is that if they don't get some guidelines and some feedback along the way, in the absence of those, they may answer a question or complete the assignment in a less than completed fashion. They need explanation, they need direction to get started, and again, make sure to give guidance and positive feedback along the way. The role of the media and the want it now mentality. So millennials have grown up getting media and entertainment when they want it, on any device they want it, wherever they want it. And that ability to provide instant gratification is just one piece of the want it now mentality that so many managers complain about when talking about millennial team members. And just understand that this is just how millennials have grown up. This is what has shaped their thinking and their reaction to events. It's this understanding and almost compassion for how millennials have grown up, which may be very different from how you grew up, that will help you to mentor and shape the millennials. And again, they are going to be 50% in 2020, 50% of the workforce. So it's important that this generation is really understood. Here's an interesting one, the ability to form meaningful relationships. So engagement with social media and phones releases an addictive substance. Now, if any of you are familiar with the work of Simon Sinek, he's a Canadian researcher and thought leader, and he does a really interesting bit on millennials and the role of social media and phones in terms of their development into adulthood. So this is, I found this really interesting when he was talking about this. So again, he said that engagement with social media and phones releases dopamine. And dopamine is a very addictive substance. So we feel good when we receive texts or someone likes us on Facebook or follows us on LinkedIn. It becomes a trauma almost to be unfriended, for example. And don't forget, on Facebook, you can create any kind of personality that you want. Now, if we think about dopamine, it's the exact same chemical that is released when we smoke or drink or gamble. It's very addictive. It's a feel-good substance and it's very addictive. And we have age restrictions on smoking and drinking and gambling, nothing about social media. An entire generation has access to dopamine through social media. So again, understand where a millennial is coming from when they may have this inability to form a meaningful relationship. Even when it comes to conversation, so much of the conversation happens through texting, where there's only a limited number of characters or words that you can use. And so having good conversation, being able to ask good questions, being able to look somebody in the eye, it can be a foreign concept to many millennials. And so with this inability to form deep relationships because of the impact on social media, think about it. You can call yourself anything on Facebook. You can create a whole different identity. And once you're actually in front of someone, this generation has trouble relating properly, maintaining eye contact or understanding body language or feeling the energy that exists, in the real world. It does make it difficult to form a real relationship. So you'll want to spend time with the millennial developing a relationship and asking questions and really trying to understand what's important to them. You don't have to look any further than the next time you go to a restaurant. And if you go into a restaurant and you see some millennials sitting at a table, they are not talking to each other. Very often they'll just be on their phones. They can be sitting right across from each other and they're on their phones. So this is very symbolic of, the latest form of communication with this particular generation. It's all done through the phone. It has a huge impact on how people relate to each other. The concept of time, live and in person, in other words, being physically present, means something very different to each generation. For one generation, for example, if they had a favorite show and it was on Friday nights, let's say at 9 o'clock, they loved the show and they had to wait a whole week before they could see the show again, Friday night at 9 o'clock. Whereas now, you can tape it, you can binge watch on Netflix. That whole concept of time and having to be physically present and adhere to a schedule has a very different meaning to a millennial. They have this attitude of, I don't really need to be here now. So flex time and virtual interaction just makes a lot more sense to a millennial. Paying dues and path to growth. So the concept of paying dues is foreign to many millennials due to helicopter parents and just the way society has treated them growing up. Again, there's sort of this no-fail concept in school, instant everything. Very important to show a millennial a path to growth with timelines and milestones and objectives, teaching them the art of patience and giving them a path. Very critical to motivate and inspire a millennial to be the best that they can be. So I'm going to give you some tips on how to manage the different generations in the workplace. I promise you these work. So the first one is to mix and match project teams. So what you want to do is think in terms of complementary skills and diverse perspectives and different age ranges, because this can prompt innovation and new problem-solving techniques. So while you may be putting together a project team based on role or function, be mindful that you have diverse representation in terms of generations. You'd be surprised at what comes out from that. Tip number 2 is all around mentoring, reverse mentoring, and lunch and learns. Again, this crosses all the generations. So mentoring, so what you'd want to do is set up a buddy system. For example, you pair a Gen X with a traditionalist, or you pair a newcomer with a long-term employee, and it provides a mentoring opportunity. Then there's reverse mentoring. Very often we think of mentoring as, for example, a traditionalist mentoring a millennial, for example. But reverse mentoring is when a younger generation teaches an older generation a few new tricks. A Gen Y, for example, teaches a boomer how to build an online profile. So there's mentoring, and then there's reverse mentoring. And then finally, there's lunch and learns. And this gives an opportunity for the generations to really get to know each other and to learn from each other. So millennials may be digital natives, but boomers know the business, for example. So you set up lunch and learns so that each generation can showcase their strengths. And for each lunch and learn, you have a different generation present something, something new to the rest of the team. Tip number 3 is to meet offsite occasionally. When we are working in a particular building, certain norms are established, certain ways of interacting with each other are established, there's certain hierarchy that exists depending on who has an office and who has a cubicle and so on and so on. Anything that shakes up the usual patterns of behavior and takes people away from their daily routine can be really productive. And it gives employees a chance to get to know each other in a less formal setting. So that all of a sudden the dividing line of generations becomes different when you're out at a restaurant or you're doing a paint night or a cooking event or something like that. Respect the power of being off-site and away from the day-to-day environment. It can make a huge difference in building relationships. This is one of my favorite things that I like to do when I'm working with an organization, and that is to create a team charter and also to create a loop of appreciation so that together the team creates a code of conduct, an agreement on how you're going to interact with each other. You can call it a code of conduct, you can call it a team charter. I happen to like the word charter. And it's agreement on how you're going to be respectful of one another. How are you going to be with each other when times get tough? And you create both a team charter as well as make individual commitments on how you personally are going to contribute to the team charter. And at least once a year, have a meeting with no other agenda than to acknowledge individual and team accomplishments. So I'll give you an example of what happened once when I went into an organization. I was asked to facilitate a very dysfunctional team. There were all kinds of issues going on with this team. And I could tell by the way they walked into the room that they were dragging their feet and they really didn't want to be here. And there were some individuals who were really nervous about what might come up because there had been several blow-ups on the team in the past. And so the first thing I did was I asked the manager prior to the meeting to give me a list of all the amazing accomplishments that this team had accomplished in the past year. And I also asked for the manager to give me one or two things about each person on the team that was really significant, a contribution that they had made or something that they were known for and were appreciated for. And I put that up on the screen, and I didn't say anything when they walked into the room. So they dragged their feet into the room and they sat down. I didn't say a word, and all of a sudden I saw them looking at the screen, and I could tell by the looks on their faces that they were a little bit stunned, and the energy started to shift in the room as they took a look and started to sort of nudge each other and comment to each other about, hey, I've forgotten that we did that, or wow, that's a lot of calls that we received this year, and so on. And then once that buzz died down, then I put up on the screen a list of accomplishments for each of the individuals on the team. And again, that same reaction as they kind of nudged each other and started to smile, and you could feel the tension just starting to evaporate in the room. I then went around the table and I asked folks how they felt about what they had just seen. And not prompted by me, all of a sudden the conversation turned into a real sort of pats on the back for each other as a team, and going even more into appreciation, where people were saying, yes, you know, Lucy, I absolutely appreciated what was on the screen, and I also really appreciated when you did such and such. It's amazing how an appreciation loop can bond a team like probably no other technique I've ever seen. So again, at least once a year, have a meeting with no other agenda than just to acknowledge individual and team accomplishments and get that team charter going, because that will really help a team that is comprised of different generations to really understand each other and understand what's important to the team. It kind of levels the playing field, because what you're doing is creating a team charter, what will serve the team, not necessarily serve the individuals on the team. And that wipes away the generational difference. Another way to really help a millennial grow and want to stay with the organization and grow with the organization is to expand job descriptions. Now, remember I said that millennials want to feel that they're making a difference, that they understand what their contribution is to the team and to the organization. And too often, a traditional job description just focuses on task. Here's what the person's going to do. And they don't put the job in context of how it fits into the team. So expand your job description so that each role is tied to a team's purpose and the company's vision. Create a job role versus outlining generic duties. Now, while I'm saying this for millennials, this actually has value for all generations, because people want to know how they are contributing. What is the impact of their work? And a job description or a job role can go a long way towards having people think about their job in a different way and thinking about the organization in a different way. And then finally, a really good management tip is don't make any assumptions about generations. Ask questions. Your staff may possess common skills, however, they also have individual needs. So ask what's important to them. What do they want to learn? What is their preferred form of communication or reward? Now, this is particularly true for millennials, and actually is true of all generations. Don't make any assumptions. Ask questions, and here are some really powerful questions that you can ask, depending on which generation that you're talking to. So if you're exploring with a millennial, for example, just an exploratory question, so you're not making any assumptions, you're asking questions. What do you want or need? What's the ideal outcome? What's important to you? What would you like to learn? What's your preferred form of communication? What do you need to make your best contribution? These are really good exploratory questions, yes, for millennials, but actually for any generation. If, for example, you're talking to a traditionalist or a boomer, and they've been around in the workplace for a while, and you want to ask honoring questions. These are really good honoring questions. Based on your experience, what do you suggest? I'm curious to know your thoughts. Have you experienced something like this before, and how did you handle it? What options do we have? I'd appreciate your thoughts on this. This goes a long way towards building relationship with those who have been with the organization for a while and really honoring their experience. If you're dealing with really any generation that is having an issue, they're either getting aggravated or they're upset about something, or they're being handed a task and they don't really understand, or they resent, being handed this task. Ask a probing question. Ask a probing question. In the bigger scheme of things, how important is this? What options do we have? How might we approach this differently? And if we were to think of this as an opportunity instead of a challenge, what's possible? It's a way of turning around a conversation or an issue into a positive. These are really good questions to ask. And quite frankly, these are good questions to ask yourself too, if you're struggling. If you're handed something, by the way, and you're looking at it and you're just thinking, oh, you're just getting really upset and you can't see the forest for the trees because you're so upset. Ask yourself a probing question. Just a really good coaching questions to ask. And then finally, if you're dealing with millennials, Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, and you want to stretch them, you want to grow them, ask for their opinion. Ask them to use their brain and really think about challenging the status quo. What improvement would you suggest to get the greatest return on time or energy or dollars? It actually is a great question to ask a team as well. Or another one of my favorite questions, because it really expands the brain, is what is currently impossible to do that if it were possible would change everything? You wouldn't believe the answers that people will come up with when they are asked that open-ended question. Other good stretch questions would be, what would you like to learn? And what are your thoughts on this? Solicit feedback. Just because you may have been in the organization longer than the person you're speaking to, it doesn't mean that they may have a fresh perspective. So ask the question, what are your thoughts on this? And these kinds of questions, these kind of bridging the gap questions are a great way to improve generational interactions. And again, these are really great questions to ask yourself, by the way, when you get stuck. So there's a little bit of homework that I hope that you'll do. And this is around improving generational relationships. Now, earlier, I asked on a poll, I asked what generation did you have the most difficulty with? And 2% said traditionalists, 25% said boomers, 23% said Gen X, and 44% said Gen Y. So here's just a little recap of how to improve generational relationships, and then we'll go into the homework. So traditionalists, remember to show respect for their length of service and experience. Take your time when discussing technology and understand their attention to formality. Boomers, choose face-to-face conversations where possible. Ask for their advice, and remember that they want their voice to be heard and their experience to count. Gen X, don't micromanage. Value their need to keep learning and to have flexibility. Describe the desired outcome on a project. Let them figure out the process. And Gen Y, understand the need for instant gratification, making a difference. Mentor them, set contexts on projects and provide feedback, and be prepared to offer flexible scheduling. Now, let's go to the homework. If you want to improve your relationship with a traditionalist, ask yourself these 4 questions. In what ways is it a pleasure to work with the traditionalists in my workplace? And in what ways is it a challenge? How can I benefit from the traditionalist's length and depth of experience to help me develop my own knowledge, skills, and abilities? And what will I commit to doing to build a better relationship with a traditionalist in my workplace? If you want to improve a relationship with a boomer, ask yourself again, in what ways is it a pleasure to work with the boomers, and in what ways is it a challenge to work with boomers in my workplace? How can I benefit from the boomers' knowledge of who's who and their political savvy to help me develop my own knowledge, skills, and abilities? And what will I commit to doing to build a better relationship with the boomer in my workplace? If you want to improve relationships with a Gen Xer, again, you ask the question, in what ways is it a pleasure and in what ways is it a challenge to work with them in my workplace? How can I benefit from the Gen Xer's entrepreneurial spirit and technical savvy to help me develop my own knowledge, skills, and abilities? And what will I commit to doing to building a better relationship with a Gen Xer in my workplace? And then finally, Gen Y, in what ways is it a pleasure and in what ways is it a challenge? How can I benefit from the Gen Y's ability to multitask and use technology to help me develop my own knowledge, skills, and abilities? And what will I commit to doing to build a better relationship with a Gen Y in my workplace? Whoops, hang on, let me go back. So I'm going to stop there and ask you to choose somebody in your workplace that you want to develop a better relationship with, somebody that you identified when you answered the question about who in your workplace, what challenge, which generation do you have the most challenge with? So choose somebody who falls within that generational category, and then ask yourself those questions that I've just outlined. Write it out, because it's really good to write these things out. And then when you go into the workplace next week, for example, after you've written everything out, try it out. Try it out to really understand in what ways is it a pleasure, in what ways is it a challenge, how can you benefit from certain characteristics of a particular type of generation, and what will you commit to doing to building a better relationship. And one way to commit to building a better relationship is, again, don't assume anything. Ask questions. Get to know somebody on a more personal level and understand what's important to them, what makes them happy, what makes them productive. I always like to end a webinar or a workshop with a commitment, where each participant makes a commitment, at least one commitment, to doing something. It's one thing to ask about, so what was your key takeaway from this workshop or from this webinar? And it's another thing to ask the question, what will you commit to doing as a result of what you've learned in this webinar or workshop? So there are some concepts here that were covered in the workshop, in the webinar, and I'd like you to choose all that apply, but we're not going to do a poll in the traditional sense. I'm going to ask you to type in your answer or answers around which of these elements are you going to commit to putting into practice. Not I'll try to do it or maybe I'll do it, but say I will do this. Will you agree to and commit to mixing and matching project teams, and or go offsite occasionally for meetings, or use the mentoring, reverse mentoring, lunch and learn suggestion, creating a team charter and having appreciation meetings, modifying job descriptions so that it becomes a role that's tied to a team's purpose and company's vision. No assumptions, ask questions, find out what's important to the person that you're speaking to and trying to develop a relationship with. And of course, choose a person in your workplace and do that generation homework that I just outlined. So I'd like you to type in any of these that you will commit to doing when you go back to your workplace with real intention and real purpose. And Kelly, I will turn it over to you.
All right. Yeah, if you guys can type those in, I see some of them coming into the questions already. So we've got a lot of the mentoring, lunch and learns, going off site for occasional team meetings. I see a lot of the no assumptions, ask questions. These are great.
Wonderful. And keep writing them in, because it's different when you think it and you actually write it down. So there's something that happens in the brain where when it flows from your head through your fingers to a keyboard or a pen, that somehow it makes the commitment stick. And I do promise you that if you choose any one of these things, to develop better relationships in your workplace amongst the generations and leverage the strengths of the different generations and manage the challenges that come with the different generations, applying something, any one of these things, or any combination of these things will make a huge difference.
Yeah, Jill, it looks like the majority of everyone has written down mix and match project teams, lunch
Yeah,
and learns, and then the no assumptions. So that's the majority
yeah.
of what we're getting. It's good.
That's excellent. That's excellent. And actually, that piece around no assumptions and ask questions, if you think about it, that kind of underlines or underlies is the foundation for all of the other things. Because asking questions and no assumptions means that you're better able to mix and match project teams and mentor people and appreciate people. So that's great. And I wish you all, the very best of luck in implementing the commitments that you've just made. I think that we're going to have time for questions. And Kelly, I think I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jill. And at this time, if you guys have any questions for Jill on today's webinar topic, please feel free to type those into the questions menu option, and we will go ahead and address those over audio. In the meantime, I want to let everyone know I will be sending out a PDF of today's PowerPoint presentation. I know there were a lot of great activities in there, so you guys will receive that later today, along with a link to view the session recording. And you can pass this on to any colleagues who were also unable to join the session. So you'll receive that later today. I wanted to also direct you guys to our website at newhorizons.com. If you are not familiar with who your local New Horizons is, you can type in your zip code and do a zip code search to find the center nearest you and reach out to them on more information. Today's webinar falls under our Center for Leadership and Development, and where we offer a variety of courses on leadership and development. So please visit our website for more information or contact your local New Horizons as well. So let's see if we have any questions. All right, Jill. On team tips, number 4, what if one or more members have no, wait, hold on. George, can you ask that question one more time? I don't think I'm reading it properly. Sorry about that. Let's see. Sorry, I'm trying to sort through all of this information here.
No problem.
Okay, let me try and read this. What if one or more members have none of the accomplishments in comparison to the team? Wait, hold on. What if one or more members have no of small accomplishments in comparison to the team or team individuals?
I think that if you really, it's a good question. I think if you really look at an individual, they will have done something. They will have done something during their daily work that made a contribution to the team. They may not have been the most necessarily productive person. They may actually, have a bit of a chip on their shoulder and sometimes contribute to team dissension. And there has to be something that they've done, where they either worked on a particular project and they did something really creative or really clever, or they are known for bringing in, pardon me, they're known for bringing in, incredible muffins, occasionally, or just something that just by virtue of their presence, that they're actually in the job. Because if they were that horrible and that non-contributory, they wouldn't be in the job in the first place. They would be out the door. So it's really a good exercise to find the good in anyone. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a work-related accomplishment. They could just be known for being, super friendly, working at the.
Hi, Jill. I think we've lost audio, unfortunately. I'll give you another minute to come back here. Sorry, everyone. It's a good thing we're at the end of today's presentation. All right. I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up. We are at the top of the hour as well. So sorry we lost Jill on audio, but thank you again, everyone, so much for attending today's session, and we hope you'll reach out to your local New Horizons for further.
My apologies.
There you
Oh, my
are.
apologies, Kelly.
That's okay.
Yes, I don't know what happened.
No problem.
My apologies. Um, so as I was saying, to just finish answering that question, there has to be something that the person has contributed, not necessarily work related. It could be that they are just really friendly to, first thing in the morning, or they're known to be a fantastic baker, or it can be anything, or maybe they stayed late one night to work to help finish up a very important project. It can be anything. It can be anything. There's always good in somebody, because if there wasn't, they wouldn't actually have the job anymore.
Right. Thank you. Great answer. And we do have one last question, if that's okay, Jill.
Mhm.
How are the generations different or similar across nationalities and countries?
That's a really good question as well. Most of the research that was presented today was based on North American research. However, a lot of the research that I've seen from other countries, it's kind of similar. It's kind of similar in terms of generational characteristics. Obviously, there will be some cultural differences. Again, don't forget that parenting styles and world events and cultural events help to shape a generation. So a cultural event or a world event and parenting may be different in Japan than it is in North America, for example, and we know that it is. And yet there are still certain characteristics that remain pretty constant. And if you are interested, there is some great literature out there about generations across borders. And so that would be if you are interested in that, I suggest that you take a look at some of the research that's out there that addresses that question very specifically.
All right, great. That's going to go ahead and wrap up today's session then. Jill, thank you again so much for joining us and speaking on behalf of New Horizons.
My pleasure.
And thank you everyone for joining us on today's webinar. I will be sending you all an email later today for the session recording and PowerPoint presentation, and I hope you all reach out to your local New Horizons for further information. Thanks so much, everyone. You may now log off. Have a great day.